Right, let's see what the folks are saying. Has your discussion with Veedu made you rethink your ideas? Or was it a bad day in the office? Ooh, spooky. Hi, my discussion with Veedu Vidz was really good. I thought I enjoyed the discussion. I think, though, if I'm gonna be honest, I think it's a good point to begin tonight's session. Evaluating some of that discussion, I think as an observation, I'd like to make an observation. You're observing, I too observe, So, the observation, people, is that, you see, the problem with, I think, atheism, let me rephrase that. A problem with atheism, ex-Muslims included in that, is that, you see, they ironically have substituted dogma for dogma. But that I find many people, and I find this with people in general, regardless of people of religion or the lack thereof, that they are people of dogma. They're not a very philosophical people. That I find this, unfortunately, with most people. And ex-Muslims or atheists in general aren't much different. Just because they've thought about religion, which I applaud them for, and they've been critical towards religion, and I applaud them for that. But it's naive to assume that they are very well balanced necessarily in their analysis. So now discussing, for example, in that discussion with Veedu Vidz, the fact that there was this failure to recognize, to even just recognize this, that when you say truth, you do understand that there is an arbitrary parameter to what you're saying. Now, the fact that wouldn't even resonate, to me, just showed like a sense of dogma. You see, because first of all, I discussed in that, I said, just coming to that discussion with Veedu Vidz, I mentioned that when you say things like, do you believe Islam is true? Now, he said like, do you believe, yeah, he said, I believe that was the question. It may have been worded slightly different, but do you believe this to be true? And I said, well, you see, it's interesting because what does that mean? Truth. Because do I believe it to be true? I do believe it to be true. Now, how are you, and where does that question go? Because you can only assess something, a truth claim can only make sense if it can be assessed. And how do you assess something like this? This isn't a maths test that you can assess it. What is it? And they said, no, well, actually, you can assess religion. And I said, well, how? How would you assess religion? Because you can assess it through historicity, and the overwhelming evidence does demonstrate that the Prophet Muhammad did exist. Okay? I mean, that's something you could assess, possibly through archaeology and sociological, historical kind of findings. Okay, so you put that aside. What are we saying now? What next? I mean, how do you assess something? You see, and the failure to accept this, or to even recognize this. And then we had this discussion on, you see, they said, well, does it correlate to, because there's many things in the Quran that don't correlate with our sense of reality. Right now, and I said that's true, but how are you reading the Quran? Are you reading it as just prose? Because would you read poetry in the same way? Would you say poetry is not true? Does that and the person said, well, and I said things like, would you read art as not being true? How? Because you see, it's a non-meaningful statement. It doesn't mean much in that context. Those contexts are not assessed by the term true. Yes, I mean, in some sense they could be. You could have a complete mythology. So, for example, somebody could say, well, there was a religion that began 20 years ago. And you say, well, actually, historically, we can't ascertain this. So, okay, so there's a claim of historicity. Or the person could say something absolutely categorically incorrect, let's say. Let's say they said in mathematically, the religion said, oh, 1 and 1 equals 4. And we mean this literally. And you say, well, that doesn't add up. Okay, fine. Or they make claims of science or of assessment that you assess. But when religions don't speak about things like that, so when a religion speaks about the soul, this is not, I mean, till date, this is not an accessible statement. You could say, well, I accept it or I reject it. But to say that's not true is actually quite dogmatic and arrogant. Because how do you assess truth on something that is unattainable or inaccessible as we stand? So, because the soul could just mean consciousness. I mean, it could mean consciousness. Or it could mean something else according to other people. But my point is, if you're going to say, well, the religion is speaking of an afterlife, well, an afterlife, as of our standpoint, is inaccessible. So how can you put a truth claim to it? I mean, you could say, I believe in it, or I don't believe in it. That's fine. But you can't measure it. And then we spoke about things like, you see, I mentioned things like idealism to highlight to them that, look, our measurements in and of themselves are very limited. And we have to at least be honest. And I mentioned things like, you know, could you even, and we got onto this thing about sound and music, and I was actually quite surprised that this, you know, it was a basic thing of really physics and science, but it wasn't being acknowledged in that dialogue, that sound isn't actually, it doesn't have a reality the way, it's just how we're interpreting vibrations. It does not have an objective reality. So the fact that this statement of mine is very difficult to digest shows either ignorance with science, or it just shows a kind of very rigid dogma. Because once, you see, this world, truly speaking, if we're objectively speaking, is colourless. It's soundless. It doesn't have sound. It's insipid. It's, you know, the world is nothing like what we are perceiving it to be, if we are speaking from a position of external objectivity. So let's just be honest. I mean, the world is not how any of us see it. So I mentioned that, you see, and you wouldn't expect God, like, let's say if you do accept the transcendent, you wouldn't expect God to address the world how it truly is. Because in its true objectivity, we can't relate to it. It would be meaningless for us. Because we would think it's absurd. But it's actually the truth. So, yeah, so I mean, so I think that was important to address that, because, but I do find, if I be honest, and I love honesty, मुनाफिकत हमसे नहीं होती यार. You know, I just can't be a hypocrite. I can be many things, but not a hypocrite. This one big problem, you know. I find that that many ex-Muslims, they too have now become tribalistic with this new identity of ex-Muslims. And the truth is that they have become, not at this stage, but this is the beginning of a new Frankenstein. You know, it's like how Nietzsche said that beware when you fight monsters, lest you shall become a monster. And I fear that this is the beginning of the very thing they set out to combat. And that was dogma. So that's my perspective. That said, I do accept that religion, you'll probably get, you know, if I suppose atheists compared to people who follow religion are it's disproportionate ratio, because the majority of the world follows some kind of a religion. So it can't be accurately assessed. But if you were to take a random kind of pick, your atheist will definitely be somebody who is at least more analytic towards religion and philosophy than your common religious person. Because that's true, that religion, unquestionably institutionalized religion, definitely pushes dogma. I mean, it doesn't just result in dogma, it pushes dogma, it peddles dogma. So that's its bread and butter, dogma. Although atheists are meant to be people very antithetical to dogma, I fear that they too will just end up with another version, an alternate version of dogma. On that note, I would like to, Talib had actually asked me, I'm not sure if he's tuned in, but right, somebody's asked about veganism. I'll come to that in a moment. You see, Talib had asked a question about what I'd said in my discussion with Veedu Vidz about meaning, and just if I could elaborate on that slightly. You see, what I was saying is that to atheists, if everything is simply the coherence of randomized matter and phenomenon, that's all it is. So randomized phenomenon has simply coherently merged and fused together, then meaning has no meaning. You understand? Everything collapses. And this is my assessment as somebody who does have faith. I fear that, you see, where you began by saying, look, religion doesn't make sense, so I will seek the truth. And the truth is something which ought to make sense. But if the truth in the is nothing, there is just nothingness, which means there is no meaning to anything. You see, the answer to absurdity cannot just be the absence of an answer. That is not an answer. That's just that there is nothing. But the fact that we are trying to seek meaning and seek truth, to me, demonstrates that there must be meaning. Hence, we can seek it and find it. And this is the argument that we call the intelligibility of being itself. Being with a capital B here. That the intelligibility of being demonstrates that meaning must carry value. There must be meaning in stuff. You understand? So, I don't know if you guys, if that makes any sense to you, or if, I don't know, my pre-workout drink is just still running. But nevertheless, I hope that makes some sense. That, you see, when people problematize religion, they are looking for the truth, meaning that which equals, there must be something meaningful that adds up. if that result is simply that there is nothing, that there is no answer, that it's all random, then the concept of meaning itself becomes random and drops, that there is no meaning. That meaning in and of itself becomes redundant. So it turns back on itself. I don't know if you guys can understand this. या या मैं कोई ज्यादा ही पहुंची हुई चीज हूं. Or am I just on a level of my own? Am I just at expert master level here? Anyway, what is